Is standing on the epistemic significance of evidence you should have had.
Thanks so much, Duncan, for inviting me to give this talk. I want to quickly set the stage here. I've been obsessed with things you should have known, evidence you should have had, and all sorts of epistemic, what originally appeared to me to be epistemic shoulds. This is a beast I've been tracking for, I think, 2 years. In the course of tracking this beast, I have given, as of today, 3 papers here in Edinburgh. The first was a paper I gave last summer called Should Have Known. The second was a paper I think I gave here in March called The Asymmetry Thesis and the Doctrine of Normative Defeat. And now this paper is trying to pay off a debt that the previous 2 papers had incurred. So the thought that I had was this, that there are cases where you don't have evidence that you should have had, and that in virtue of not having that evidence, your justification is defeated. You're not justified in believing as you do. In some of those cases, in fact, in many of those cases, we might even say you should have known something that you didn't know. But I never offered a theory of the conditions under which justification was defeated. And it dawned on me, as I was thinking about it, that there are at least 3 things that you can say on the question of what defeats your justification. The first thing you can say is this: whenever you don't have evidence that you should have had, justification is defeated. The second thing you can say is this: whenever you should have had evidence and you have reasons to believe that there's evidence that you should have had, justification is defeated. And the third thing that you can say is, whenever you should have had further evidence, and if you would have had that evidence, your belief wouldn't have been justified, then justification is defeated. And what I realized about my own work, and I have to say most of the work of other people who've worked on this, is that no one had a systematic theory as to which of these, and it need not be only one, could be 2 or 3, which of these gives the proper theory of justification defeat through evidence you should have had. So what I'm trying to do today is to actually give you what I'd call the beginning of a theory of justification defeat. Details still need to be worked out. I should also say that I'm not entirely confident of the arguments that I'm going to be giving you today. I'm confident enough to present them publicly and see how well they hold up. But I welcome all comments, and especially criticisms, because, as I say, these are still topics I'm thinking about. I'm going to be focusing on 2 kinds of questions to help me get at the issue that I'd like to get at. First of all, we can distinguish between the evidence that you have and the evidence that you should have had. And with respect to the evidence that you have, we can talk about the evidence that you have for thinking that the proposition that P is true, and the evidence that you have for thinking that there's further evidence that you should have, and it's likely bearing on your belief. Call that second kind of evidence higher order evidence. I'm interested in knowing how your higher order evidence relates to the evidence that you should have had. How do those 2 things play with one another? In particular, I'm interested in what I call clashing cases. Cases where, given the evidence that you have about the evidence that you should have had, suppose that evidence is misleading. Either it tells you that there is no further evidence, but in fact there is, or it tells you that there is further evidence, and it tells you that that evidence will further help you, but in fact there is further evidence and that evidence would hurt you, would further infirm your belief. What to say about these cases of clashes? That's a question that, to the best of my knowledge, hasn't yet been systematically approached in the literature. And the second kind of case I'm going to be thinking about today are cases where there's further evidence that you should have had, and if you had had it, it would only have helped you. That is, it would have given you more evidence for thinking that your belief that P is true. What should we say about those cases as well? What struck me as interesting is that when we think about evidence you should have had, we always have in mind the case where that evidence is bad. But surely there are cases where you should have had further evidence, and had you had it, you would have been even more justified in believing. What should we say about those cases as well? So the theory that I'm going to offer you today is a theory that tries to do justice to our intuitions about all of these kinds of cases. Last caveat before I jump into this: I am shamelessly going to be developing my theory in ways that I tell my graduate students it's not the best way to develop your theory, namely by appeal to intuitions about particular cases and just building up. I don't love this because it always strikes me that when you build a theory like that, you're not really getting any illumination. What you're really doing is you're just tailoring your theory to your evidence. I'm going to be doing that because this is in the early stage of development. I will end today by giving you what I regard as theoretical reasons to think that the view that I end up with actually does give us some illumination, is interesting, and actually can make some interesting and potentially provocative predictions. So that's what I'm going to be doing today. To make a long story short, my view is going to be this. I'm going to defend a view that I call the epistemic ceiling principle view. The evidence that you have places an epistemic ceiling on the degree of justification that you can have. The evidence that you should have had places an epistemic ceiling on the degree of justification that you can have. Put those two things together, the lower degree of justification determined by these two things is the degree of justification that your belief enjoys. This view has, as an implication, something that I'm going to call, appealing to my American legal theorist friends, the doctrine of epistemic strict liability. I'm going to borrow the notion of strict liability from the law, and that notion is going to do some work for me at the very end of this. So I'll get there hopefully by the end of the talk. Okay. So quickly, I want to get through the first section the second section relatively quickly, so that we can jump to the substantial discussions. I'm going to be talking about evidence that you have and evidence that you should have had. With respect to the evidence that you should have had, I'm going to talk about that evidence as either helpful, harmful, or neutral, according to whether if you had acquired it, it would have further justified you. If you had acquired it, it would have further infirmed your justification, or it doesn't either further justify you or infirm your justification. Then I'm going to be talking about the epistemic significance of the evidence that you do have, and I'm going to be focusing on the higher order evidence that you have. In particular, the higher order evidence that you have for thinking that there's further evidence that you ought to have. Just to whet your appetite a little bit, how could you have evidence that there's further evidence you ought to have? Well, suppose you're a member of a research team, and suppose that it's your responsibility to report to the team whenever there's a new development in your field that has a potential bearing on the outcome of the team's investigations. And suppose that you have a colleague who is really, really, really good at following all of the developments in the literature, and she tells you, oh, by the way, you have to check out this new study. There's a new study out there that's potentially interesting to your team. Then before you actually check out that study, you have evidence that there's further evidence you should have. By the way, I'm using evidence very, very liberally. I should say this is for Stephen in particular. I'm using this so liberally that testimony counts as evidence in ways that I think I can actually spell this out in ways that won't inflame you, but I'm using evidence very, very liberally in that regard. So that's how you can have evidence that there's further evidence that you ought to have. You also might have evidence for further evidence you ought to have in terms of track records, right? So, for example, you might work in an area, say epistemology, where you know that new arguments come out with some regularity. You know this because you've studied epistemology long enough to know that they do. And so you might well know that because you haven't been in a library or done a literature search in the last 10 months, there's a very, very good chance that there is evidence that will bear on the things that you're thinking about. There's a lovely paper, by the way, this is a shameless pitch for a paper that I just read and loved, by Nathan Ballantyne that's coming out in Phil Quarterly, on the epistemic significance of evidence you don't possess. It's a really lovely paper. He's actually interested in all of the evidence you don't possess. I'm only interested in the evidence that you should have had. There may well be much more evidence that you don't have, but if it's not the case that you should have had it, for my purposes today, it's epistemically inert. So when it comes to the higher order evidence that you have about further evidence you should have had, I'm going to describe your higher order evidence as either happy, unhappy, neither, or null, according to whether. So your higher order evidence is happy if it supports the twin hypothesis that there is further relevant evidence you ought to have, and this further evidence would render help true, and so on and so forth for unhappy. Neither the neither category is a category that actually combines three different cases into one. For my purposes today, those cases don't matter. For example, it doesn't matter whether you have evidence that there is no evidence, or you may have evidence that there is further evidence, but that evidence is neutral, is likely to be neutral, or you may have evidence that there is further evidence, but you don't know whether the evidence is neutral or happy or unhappy. I'm putting all of those into the neither category, and then finally the null category is the category in which you don't have any higher order evidence bearing one way or the other. that there may be no such cases, but I want, for completeness, I want to have that as a possibility. An assumption that I'm making, an assumption that I defend in the paper should have known that I'm not going to defend here, but I'll be happy to in Q&A. It is a controversial assumption, but I think it's true. The assumption is this. It can be true of you that you should have had further evidence, even though you don't have any evidence suggesting that you should have further evidence. That can be true. I won't tell you why I think that. It turns out to be somewhat complicated, although I'm happy to go into it in Q&A, but I will be occasionally talking about that assumption in what follows. I don't think anything really crucial hangs on it, but occasionally I will appeal to it to make some subsidiary points. Okay, now we can get a nice taxonomy going. If you think of the variations in the evidence that you have, in particular the higher order evidence that you have, and the variations in the evidence that you should have had, and you enumerate all those variations, you get a nice little taxonomy that gives us 12 types of case. Those 12 types of case are laid out on page 3, right above the illustrating cases. What I thought to do in this paper was just run through these cases and see what our intuitions are in these various cases and see if I can get a theory that actually accommodates all of our intuitions. Let me just quickly go over one case because it's a case that I don't think we've thought about much before. That's the very first case on our taxonomy. This is where your higher order evidence is happy and the evidence that you should have had is helpful. How could a case like that arise? Well, imagine that, again, that you're in this research team, your friend tells you that there's further evidence out there that you should look at, and she also tells you, oh, but don't worry about it because that evidence actually even further offers you further support, you and your team further support for the belief that P, or the hypothesis that P. Then you have happy higher order evidence. Suppose that your friend is actually correct. Were you to go and look in the library and the studies, you'd find that all these further studies in fact offer you further support. That means the evidence you should have had is helpful. This is a happy helpful case. In a happy helpful case, it looks like the epistemic world is smiling on you, and I'm going to talk about what should we say justification-wise in happy helpful cases in a moment. But in any case, I'm not going to go through all the 12 cases. You get a sense of how you can set them up by varying one or the other of the dimensions of variability. Okay. So, my main question is how these two sources of variability play off of one another, in particular with respect to the question of justification, of your justification for believing. So let me start off with what I hope will be the least controversial things that I'm going to say today. Least controversial, but unfortunately not uncontroversial. And that is to look at cases where you have unhappy higher order evidence. That is, you have evidence to think that there's further evidence that you should have, and your evidence also suggests that that further evidence is likely to have an unhelpful bearing on your belief that P. What I want to say about these cases is the following. That the degree of justification your belief that P has diminishes in proportion to the unhappiness of your higher order evidence. The degree of justification that your belief has diminishes in proportion to the degree of unhappiness of your higher order evidence. For example, if your higher order evidence tells you that there's evidence that's out there that you should have, and that evidence is evidence that not P, is extremely good evidence that not P. In fact, better evidence that not P than any of your evidence that you do have is in favor of P, then you're not justified in believing that P. Your higher order evidence can actually make it the case that you're not justified in believing that P. If you have evidence that there's further evidence out there that's unhelpful, perhaps you just have evidence that it's unhelpful, but you don't know how unhelpful it is. Well, at least to the degree that you think it's unhelpful, that's going to diminish your justification for believing. I think this is true independent of the actual evidence that you should have had, independent of its actual bearing. So the idea is, if you have unhappy higher order evidence, your justification is diminished accordingly. I say to you that this is the least uncontroversial claim that I'm going to be making today, but not entirely uncontroversial. Here's a side note. For those of you that have followed the recent literature on defeaters, you will know that there are several people who have argued that in fact the way that many of us in epistemology think of defeaters is fundamentally wrong. The person that I have in mind, I think her work is wonderful, is Maria Lacino-Arnio at the University of Michigan, who actually would take cases like this and suggest that if your higher order evidence is misleading, then it does not defeat your justification. I am assuming she's wrong about this, but I'm not arguing with her here. So I just want to flag this, that what I'm saying is it may be the least uncontroversial thing among the things that I'm arguing, but it's not uncontroversial. And if anyone wants to talk about Maria's really interesting work, I'm happy to do that in Q&A. So the idea is this: unhappy higher order evidence, to the degree that it's unhappy, your justification is diminished. That is independent of the actual bearing of the evidence that you should have had. Whether it itself is helpful, unhelpful, or neutral, your justification is diminished accordingly. I want to suggest that what this suggests is single star on your handout on page 3. When S's evidence E contains relevant unhappy higher order evidence EHO, E establishes a justificatory ceiling for the justification of S's belief that P, and does so in a way that is independent of the epistemic significance of the evidence that S should have had. Again, I think this is relatively uncontroversial, bracketing Maria's excellent work, but there you have it. I think that's certainly for those of us who think that evidence that you should have had can defeat justification. If you think that, if you're not with Maria on that, then I think you're going to think that this is the most plausible thing to think about your higher order evidence. Okay, what should we say about cases, though, where your higher order evidence is either neutral or happy? I've said in the case where your higher order evidence is unhappy, it establishes a justificatory ceiling. You can go that high with your degree of justification and no higher. What should we say, though, about the case where your higher order evidence is either neutral or happy? Well, I think we can say the same thing. Why do I think that? Well, think of it this way. If you don't say that, you're saying you can have certain higher order evidence, and yet the evidence that you don't have can actually further help you. That is, help you beyond the point that the evidence that you have actually helps you. And that seems to me to be a crazy view. It's a crazy view to suppose that you're not having evidence that you should have had can actually further help you. And if you think that that is a crazy view, then you're going to accept a generalization of star. You're going to accept what I call double star on the handout. And that is, S's evidence E establishes a justificatory ceiling for the justification of S's belief that P, and does so in a way that is independent of the epistemic significance of the evidence S should have had. That's one epistemic ceiling principle. And I think that principle actually captures the battery of the battery of intuitions that we have in cases where we're focusing only on our higher order evidence. We're not focusing at all on the evidence that you should have had. What happens when we turn our attention to away from the evidence that you actually have to the evidence that you should have had? So I want to consider some of these cases now. Let's begin with the case where that evidence is happy. The evidence you should have had is happy. In other words, if you had had it, if you had acquired it, it would have only further enhanced your justification for believing that P. What should we say about these cases? Well, let's start by looking at a case where your higher order evidence is happy as well. So you had reasons to think that that would happen. That is, if you had acquired, you have reasons to think that if you go out there and get the evidence that you should have, that evidence will only further enhance your justification. What happens when we have a happy, helpful case? Here's one thought. Your belief is justified. After all, your higher order evidence leads you to think that although there is further evidence you should have had, that evidence will itself be only helpful, and in point of fact, that evidence is helpful. It seems like in this kind of case, there is some intuitive pull, I would say a strong intuitive pull, to the idea that your belief remains justified. Yes, but you can still have the nagging suspicion that we ought to be able to say something about the fact that you don't have all the evidence that you should have had. And in fact, some might think that if there is evidence that you should have had and you don't have it, that itself defeats your justification. Some might think that. I can't yet give you my final verdict on this. What I want to say at this point is the following. Any theory of the epistemic significance of evidence that you should have had better be able to explain both the intuitive pull to the justification verdict, justified verdict, and also whatever there is to the idea that something is in some sense there's something that's missing here. Maybe it doesn't render the belief unjustified, but there's something that's missing, and that gives us some sense that maybe there is some degree of unjustifiedness in the belief. A theory in this area had better be able to explain all of that, and I'm going to try to get to that theory at the end of my discussion. Let's go to other cases. Other cases where you're hold fixed the helpfulness of the evidence you should have had. Let's now vary the higher order evidence that you have. What happens when the higher order evidence you have is not happy but it's neutral? I think this case is a case very much like the case that I just described. The only difference really is that you don't have reasons to think that the evidence that you should have had is happy. Maybe you have reasons to think that there is no such evidence. Maybe you have reasons to think that there is evidence, but it's going to be neutral. But in any case, it seems to me, in these kinds of cases, that there's a strong pull to say that your belief is justified. Why? That's on the basis of the first order evidence you have. And yet there still remains this intuition that something has gone wrong because, after all, there is evidence that you should have had. Similarly, with a case where you don't have any higher order evidence, I think that case pattern's exactly like the two that we just described, with the exception that in that case you don't even have evidence to think that there's further evidence. Nevertheless, I think there still is some degree, some intuitiveness behind the idea that your belief is justified, and some lingering suspicion that there has to be some significance to the fact that you didn't collect all the evidence that you should have. Let's now move to a more interesting case, a class. Let's move to a case where the evidence that you should have had is unhappy. Sorry, the evidence you should have had is harmful. I'm not using my language right. The evidence that you should have had is harmful, but your higher order evidence is happy. So here's the case, concrete case. You're in a research team. You're responsible for following all developments in the field. Your friend, who's highly reliable, tells you that, yeah, there's further evidence out there, but that evidence would only be helpful. You believe her, so you have happy, higher order evidence. Lo and behold, and in a way that's completely out of character, she didn't actually do a great literature search, and it turns out that there is evidence out there that's harmful. So this is a clashing case. Your higher order evidence leads you to believe one thing. The evidence you should have had actually would lead you to believe something false of the evidence that you should have had. That evidence actually is harmful, even though the evidence that you had about that evidence suggested that it would be helpful. What should we say about these kinds of cases? Here's my thought. Insofar as you come into this discussion already thinking that evidence that you should have had can defeat justification, this is a case where it defeats justification. This is a case where the actual epistemic bearing of the evidence that you should have had actually trumps the epistemic significance of the evidence that you do have. If you are the person who should have collected the evidence, and you had evidence to think that the evidence you should have collected would have only been helpful, but in fact it was harmful, I think that defeats justification. Certainly your team, the rest of your team relying on you, is not going to be very happy to learn that you didn't do your duty, that you didn't actually collect the evidence that it was your responsibility to collect. They might allow you to excuse yourself by saying that, well, you know, I had good evidence to think that that evidence was only going to be helpful. They might allow that as an excuse, but that excuse does not track justification. What I want to suggest is that in that case, at best, you're excused. But whether or not you're excused, your belief is unjustified. And I'm hoping that anyone who thinks that evidence that you should have had can defeat justification will think this is a case. And if that's true, that's going to be true no matter what your higher order evidence is. Because if it's true in the case where your higher order evidence is happy, it's all the more true in cases where your higher order evidence is either neutral or unhappy, or even in the case of null. What this suggests, I think, is something quite interesting. I think it suggests what I called plus on your handout. In cases in which S's total evidence contains higher order evidence which is unhappy, S's belief that P can be no more justified than it would have been had she accepted evidence that she should have had and updated in a rational fashion. In fact, it actually supports something stronger, double star. S's belief that P can be no more justified than it would have been had she acquired evidence that she should have had and updated in a rational fashion. So the idea is this. I'm hoping that many of you share my intuitive verdicts here. If not, I might actually have to give you some arguments for them. And I'll try to, at the end, to give you some reasons why I think these intuitive verdicts are the right ones. The idea is this. You have a justificatory ceiling that evidence that you should have had provides for you. You can be no more justified in believing that P on evidence E than you would be if you had had all the evidence that you should have had. That is the highest degree of justification that you can have. If you put that point, that epistemic sealing principle, together with my first epistemic sealing principle, you reach what I call the epistemic sealing principle, which I call ECP on your handout. Given a subject S's belief that P, based at time T on evidence E, if there's evidence that S should have had at T, then S's belief that at T can be no more justified than it is on E, and it can be no more justified than it would have been if S had acquired all the evidence that she should have had at T and updated in a rational fashion. The idea is this: the lower of those 2 degrees of justification is the ceiling. The lower of those 2 degrees of justification is the ceiling. Your degree of justification can be no higher than that. Okay, so how do we tell how high it is? That just establishes an upper bound. Here's my thought. My thought is that that's all you need. ECP is all you need to do the calculation of degree of justification. It's the only relevant principle on this matter. How am I going to argue for this? My argument, admittedly, is not entirely waterproof. It's an inference to the best explanation. What I'm going to try to suggest in the remainder of this paper, in the remaining time that I have, and Duncan, can you remind me how much time I have?
15 minutes.
Okay, and that'll leave enough time for Q&A?
Yeah, plenty.
Okay. What I'm going to do in the remainder of this time is just try to, on the assumption that ECP is the only principle that's relevant here, and so whatever the lower degree of justification of those two parameters is going to be your degree of justification, what I'm going to suggest is that you have all you need in order to explain the battery of intuitions in the cases that I've considered, including the intuitions where right now I've remained neutral, where I've just merely said we're pulled in 2 directions, we need explanations of both of the poles. Okay, suppose that ECP is in fact the only only principle that you need in order to determine justification in these cases. Then it's clear that what you're going to say in cases of happy, helpful cases, what you're going to say is that the person is justified. Justified why? Because the first order evidence supports the belief that P. The higher order evidence suggests that while there is more evidence out there, it's only helpful, and in fact the evidence that you should have had is helpful. So both of the ceilings are relatively high, and the lower of those 2 ceilings is the ceiling that determines your justification. What about clash cases? Clash cases are relatively straightforward. Clash cases are going to be cases where the lower of the 2 degrees, the lower the degree of justification is the one that trumps. If your higher order evidence was misleading you into thinking that the evidence would be better than it is, then the badness of that evidence puts a ceiling on your justification. If your higher order evidence misleads you into thinking that the evidence out there is going to be worse than it actually is, then your evidence is what puts the ceiling on your degree of justification. Either way, the lower the degree of justification in these 2 dimensions is going to be the degree of justification that you enjoy for your belief. That is, as it were, the proposal that I'm making. And there's one implication of this proposal that is worth highlighting, because this is the implication that I'm going to use to explain the battery of intuitions in the complicated cases. And that is the implication that I think I called on your handout, the doctrine of epistemic strict liability. This is on page 5 of your handout. The doctrine of epistemic strict liability. Basically, what the doctrine of epistemic strict liability says is that insofar as there is further evidence that you should have that you don't have, you are strictly liable to that evidence, no matter what evidence you have about its existence or its likely bearing on your belief. You are strictly liable in the sense that if that's bad evidence, you suffer the consequences, even if you had excellent reasons to think that the evidence was not going to be bad. That doctrine, the doctrine of epistemic strict liability, is, I think, the key to making sense of all of the intuitions in the complicated cases. And that's what I now want to go on to argue. Okay, I started off by asking, what is the mechanism for generating defeat when evidence that you should have had actually defeats you, defeats your justification? And what I pointed out is that it can come from one of 2 sources. It can either come from your own evidence, in particular your higher order evidence regarding the evidence that you should have had, or it can come from the evidence that you should have had. If the evidence that you should have had is unhelpful, if it's such that if you would have had it, you would have been unjustified, then that evidence itself defeats justification. If that's correct, then any temptation that we have to ascribe epistemic significance to the fact that there's evidence that you should have that you don't have is mistaken. That is, insofar as any one of us feels a temptation to ascribe epistemic significance, as opposed to other kinds of significance, to the fact that there's further evidence that you should have had, that temptation is mistaken. That falls out directly from my theory. It's one thing to have a theory that tells you that you have to give up the temptation. It's another theory to explain why we were tempted in the first place. And that I'm going to conclude by giving you my account of the temptation itself. This is where I'm going to put to work what I'm calling the doctrine of epistemic strict liability. In order for me to explain away the temptation, it's important for me to put you in a mindset where you can feel the grip of the temptation. So let me give you the following case. This is the best case I can think of for giving you a sense of why someone might feel tempted to ascribe epistemic significance to the fact that there is further evidence that somebody should have, that they don't have. Consider the following case. I call it party. I want to know whether Jones is coming to the party tonight. I know that she said last week that she was coming, but I worry that she might have changed her mind, so I ask you to confirm with her. However, you have no reason to suspect I have such a worry, and you're already in possession of excellent evidence for thinking that she is coming. In addition to having heard Jones say last week that she was coming to the party, you also have evidence of Jones' track record as to being very steadfast in her decisions, and so have reasons to think that she would not have changed her mind in the interim. So later that day, without going to the trouble of reconfirming with her, you tell me that she is in fact coming. As things turn out, Jones didn't change her mind, so she is coming to the party. However, uncharacteristically, she almost changed her mind, and had she done so, you would have been none the wiser. There are a number of as I reread this, there are a number of complications in here that I don't think are crucial for the case. But I'm going to leave the case as it is until Q&A forces me to cut back the complications. But you can imagine someone who says the following. Look, when you didn't confirm with Jones by asking her whether she still plans on coming to the party, you subjected me to an epistemic risk. You subjected me to an epistemic risk. After all, she almost changed her mind, and had she changed her mind, you would have been none the wiser. It seems in that sense you subjected me to an epistemic risk. You might think, so the argument might go, that that risk is incompatible with justification. You can't be giving me justification and subjecting me to the epistemic risk at one and the same time. If you like that reasoning, you might actually say the reasoning goes through no matter how objectively likely it was that Jones would have changed her mind. You might say that, and if you say that, you've got the temptation. The temptation just is to say it's the bare fact, or perhaps the fact that you have reasons to believe that it's a fact, that there's evidence that you should have had, that defeats justification. In this case, it would be the bare fact, since you don't have reasons to believe, be the bare fact that there's evidence that I should have had, or that you should have had, that defeats your justification. So that raises the interesting question. Can we capture a notion of epistemic risk, which is such that that notion of epistemic risk is the presence of that kind of epistemic risk is incompatible with justification? That's the idea. And what I'm going to suggest is that the arguments that look like that might support that don't support it, and in fact, the battery of intuitions that we have in this case are better explained in another way altogether. In order to make this out, let me distinguish between three different issues that you face when you think about the party case. There's the modal issue. How easily might the belief that Jones is coming to the party have been? There's another modal issue that roughly tracks that one. How easily might it have been the case that you would have gotten evidence that would have been harmful? That's the modal issue. There's the normative issue. What standard or what standards are violated in your failure to have acquired the evidence you should have had? I call that the normative issue. And then there's the evaluative issue. What is the epistemic significance of your violation of that standard or those standards? Those are the three issues I think we have to face when thinking about the party case. Now, I think people who think about epistemic risk and who want to think that there's a notion of epistemic risk here which is incompatible with the transfer of justification, I think the notion they have in mind actually gives a lot of weight to the modal issue. Their thought is the mere fact that that easily you could have been wrong itself defeats justification. I think that's not right. One way to see that it's not right is the following. If you had gotten the evidence that you should have had, you asked Jones and she confirmed she's coming to the party, it's still true that easily she might have changed her mind. So the modal issue is still there. Easily the proposition might have been false. Of course, you wouldn't have believed the proposition, but it still would have been false. So maybe it's the fact that in the party case, your belief is unsafe. There's a nearby world in which you believe what you believe in the exact same way that you believe it through the same process, but in fact, in that world, your belief is false. What I want to suggest is that if that's true, that's not a defeater of justification. That merely says the person doesn't know. So if you go in for safety theory, then I'm going to suggest to you that the analysis that you want to have of this case is not that justification is defeated, but that the person doesn't know. The person doesn't know. So that's not going to get you off the hook either. So it looks like there's going to be no clear argument from the way we settle the modal issue to the conclusion that there's no justification in this case. If that's true, what I want to suggest to you is that we might want to think about things in a completely different way. In fact, we might want to think about things in terms of what I'm calling the doctrine of epistemic strict liability. I'll come back to the normative issue and the evaluative issue in a second. Let me introduce the notion of strict liability as follows. I do this from US law. I don't know whether or not the same thing is true in UK law, but in US law, when effects are governed by a standard of strict liability, the violator is strictly liable for any harms that result to others, even if the violator had excellent reasons to think that no one would have been harmed. To illustrate, consider a company that makes a product that has the potential to harm people if it were to malfunction. Insofar as the possibility of harm was foreseeable, US tort law might then impose a standard of strict liability on the company that manufactures it. If the product produces harm, if it harms anyone, then the company is held liable for damages, whatever the intentions or degree of care the company exhibited in manufacturing the product. They can't get themselves off the hook by saying, but we did absolutely everything we could have done. That doesn't get you off the hook. If the standard is one of strict liability, if there's harm, there's a foul, no matter what degree of care or attentiveness you took. Now suppose that despite its best efforts, the company failed to rule out a possible source of malfunction that might easily have arisen in a given case. But imagine further that even so the product doesn't malfunction, and so those using it are unharmed. Then the company isn't liable for any damages. Still, we might think that the company did not do all that it should have done to ensure the protection of those using its products. And this, I want to suggest, is the analog of the party case. There was no epistemic harm done, but in fact the speaker, you, did not do all that you should have done to protect the hearer, me, from the risk of epistemic harm. This is a moral failing of yours, but, lucky for you, given how the case turned out, the justification of your belief doesn't suffer any corresponding epistemic downgrade. So what I'm suggesting is this. In the company case, there was a risk of harm. The company perhaps didn't do all that it should have done to protect people from the risk of harm. No harm done. No harm done, no damages to be paid. In the epistemic case, you didn't do all that you should have done to protect me from epistemic harm. What is the epistemic harm I'm talking about? Unjustifiedness. You didn't properly protect me from unjustifiedness. I can morally censure you for this, but in fact, things turned out okay. You were justified after all. So what I'm suggesting is that we split the normative dimension. There's a standard that you violated. That's the moral standard, or the interpersonal standard, or the social standard, or the professional standard. I can hold you accountable for that. You did not at the same time, albeit through no thanks to your own efforts, violate the epistemic standard, because the evidence out there would only have been further helpful. So I'm suggesting that there are two standards in play. In the party case, the way to read this is that you violated the moral standard. You owed it to me. You owed it to me to ask. You didn't ask. I can blame you for that. You did not violate the epistemic standard, albeit through no thanks to your own efforts. So it's clear what kind of evaluation I'm going to come down on. You are morally reproachable, albeit you actually testified in a way that manifested a justified belief. That's the way I want to suggest it. Furthermore, I now want to diagnose the temptation itself. as based on an understandable, but nevertheless still real confusion. It's one thing to say that you shouldn't subject someone to the risk of unjustifiedness. You morally should not subject someone to the risk of unjustifiedness in belief. It's another thing to say that your testimony or the belief you're manifesting in your testimony is itself unjustified. Merely risking unjustifiedness in belief is not itself a kind of unjustifiedness. What these cases point out, if my analysis of them is right, is that you can risk unjustifiedness without being unjustified, and that's precisely what you are doing in the party case. Those people who think that the mere risk of unjustifiedness is itself a kind of unjustifiedness will give in to the temptation. I'm suggesting that conflates a moral claim with epistemic content for an epistemic claim. The moral claim with epistemic content is don't subject people to the risk of epistemic unjustifiedness. That claim doesn't amount to an epistemic claim, nor, I submit, does it entail an epistemic claim. So the lesson of these kinds of cases is we should really distinguish sharply between the ethics and the epistemology in cases involving evidence that you should have had. In cases of evidence that you should have had, my impression is that there's always at least a prima facie case, moral case, or if you like, interpersonal professional case, or sometimes legal case, to be made against someone. But it doesn't follow from that there's an epistemic case to be made against them. That is, a case to say that their belief is unjustified. Even those of us who think that evidence that you should have had can defeat justification should accept as much. Or so I'm claiming to you today. Okay, the coda of this, why think this is the right way to approach evidence you should have had? Why not take what I said about the temptation and make that point large? Why not say the following? Evidence that you should have had never is epistemically relevant. It's always only morally relevant. Why not say that? Why not say, for example, that the case of somebody who should have had evidence out there, there's evidence she should have had, why not say that, in fact, that evidence itself is never epistemically significant? She could be morally blamed, but there's never any epistemic significance to ascribe to that evidence. Two reasons that I don't think this is right. One reason, which is kind of a small reason, but I'll give it to you very quickly, is this. I think it actually makes false predictions. That is, predictions that don't accord with our intuitions. For example, in the party case, imagine that Jones had changed her mind after all. I want to suggest that in that case, you actually are unjustified. And I think that's, at least, if you come into this debate already thinking that evidence you should have had can defeat justification, I think your intuition is going to be that this just is a case of this sort. And the view I'm now imagining gets that one wrong. Still, you might want to dig in your heels. Yeah, but come on, okay, I'll bite the bullet. I'll say that the testimony there is justified, the belief is justified. You're just morally, the testifier is morally wrong to have testified without collecting all the evidence she should have had. Here's my second programmatic reason for thinking that evidence you should have had is epistemically significant. And this is what I put last on your handout. It's something like this. The picture that I'm working with is a picture in social epistemology. The picture in social epistemology says the following. We are systematically reliant on other people in our community in all sorts of ways for what we know about the world. We are inelimitably reliable on those folks, and furthermore, the rationality of our reliance on them is backed by the kinds of expectations that we have of them as epistemic subjects. Those expectations, like the expectation that if you are asked legitimately to collect evidence, you ought to collect evidence, things like this, those expectations often rationalize our reliance on other people as sources of information. And what I want to suggest is that when someone violates a legitimate expectation that you have, epistemology itself ought to be able to acknowledge that, ought to be able to take account of that. And what I'm suggesting here is a way of accounting for that. There's the evidence that you have. That's what you have in your possession, that's great. And then the evidence that you should have had reflects my or our proper expectations of you to have had this kind of evidence. If we in epistemology can't see that as at least potentially epistemically significant, my own view is that epistemology becomes the poorer for it. And I'll stop there.